Hello, everyone. Welcome back to OS 22. So let's head straight into the panel. This panel is titled "How Can Space Security Be Achieved? Past, Present, and Future Efforts and Practical Measures for PAROS." And I'm happy to say that again we have a wonderful lineup of panelists, but I'm going to let our Deputy Director, Cecile Aptel, who is here with me and who will be moderating the panel, I'm going to let her introduce the panelists. Thank you very much, Cecile. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Almu. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back, whether you're here in the room in Geneva or online. Over the years, many different mechanisms and processes have been proposed to address space security concerns and to achieve the goals of PAROS. This very esteemed panel will be looking at the past and the present initiatives that states have undertaken to address space security concerns, and will also seek to consider what lessons can be learned for the future. We'll try to pay particular attention to some initiatives, including the draft treaty on the prevention of the placement of weapons in outer space and of the threat or use of force against outer space objects, the draft International Code of Conduct for outer space activities, the Hague Code of Conduct against Ballistic Missile Proliferation, and a group of governmental experts on TCBMs in outer space activities and on advancing a legally binding mechanism for PAROS, as well as other, including the most recent open-ended working group on reducing threats through norms, rules, and principles of responsible behavior. To discuss these issues, I cannot think that we could have a better set of experts and a wonderful lineup here to share your views with us. So thank you very much to all of you, dear panelists. First, to my right, and by order, in fact, in which I will give you the floor, is Ambassador Guilherme de Aguiar Patriota, who is the Consulate General of Brazil in Tokyo, and as you all know, was the chair of the group of governmental experts on further effective measures for the prevention of an arms race in outer space, PAROS, and is also the former special representative of Brazil to the Conference on Disarmament. A career diplomat, you've also been delegate of Brazil to the OAS in Washington, among many different other distinguished viewpoints. So thank you very much and welcome, Ambassador. Next is Mr. Zi Zhaoyu, who is currently disarmament counselor at the permanent mission of China to the UN in Geneva, and before that served notably as the deputy division chief in the Department of Arms Control of the Chinese Foreign Ministry. Welcome, Mr. Zi. Next is Mr. Andrei Bulosov, who is currently the deputy permanent representative of the Russian Federation in Geneva, and served before that notably as the head of the multilateral disarmament division in the Department for Non-Proliferation and Arms Control at the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and has been also a permanent, among many other tasks, has been also a permanent member of the Russian delegation in the first committee of the UN General Assembly since 2012, and has also participated in the open-ended consultations on the draft International Code of Conduct for outer space activities. Next, we have Mr. Xavier Pascoe, who is the director at the Foundation for Strategic Research and also the editor-in-chief for Europe of the Space Policy Review, and an expert at the European Economic and Social Committee and a member of the International Academy of Astronautics. And further to my right, your left, is Ms. Jessica West, who is a senior researcher at the Canadian Peace Research Institute Project Plowshares, and a research fellow at the Kindred Credit Union Center for Peace Advancement, and also a senior fellow at the Center for International Governance Innovation. So you will agree with me that with such a wonderful lineup, we really will have a chance of discussing this topic. So we will first have an opportunity of hearing your respective views maybe on the broader topic, how can space security be achieved? And so I would very much like to first give you the floor, Mr. Patriota, for up to 10 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Cecile, and I would like to thank, through Almudena, UNIDIR, and also the organizers of the Space Security Conference, the Secure World Foundation, for the opportunity to be here today. I am Consul General of Brazil in Tokyo, so outer space is no longer my everyday topic of conversation. I was actually coordinating elections just last Sunday in Tokyo. We had some 14,000 Brazilians voting there. But now back to outer space. I was thinking of how I could be useful in any way as the former chair of the last GGE on PAROS. Actually, Andrei Belousov and others here were members of that GGE, so it's very nice to be here and together again with you in this panel. And so my approach will be a little bit comparing my experience in the PAROS GGE with what's going on now in the open-ended working group. And I would start right away just commenting, as I usually do, the differences in the mandates, which I think are quite substantial. So I think it's very useful to compare. And usually in my comparison, I include the GGE on cybersecurity, which I also chaired. That was GGE number 6, the last one, which actually achieved consensus, though the one on PAROS did not. So they have different kinds of mandates and some similarities and differences, which are very useful to note. The second PAROS GGE had a very tight mandate focused towards legally providing elements for a legally binding instrument and taking into consideration, among other things, the PPWT that was just mentioned here. So it was very much tied to producing elements for a treaty. It was not really, it was not mandated to address or to produce the norms, rules, and principles that we are now talking about in the current OEWG. And so that generated more difficulties, I think, because in the end, already in that GGE, we had sort of two groups, two trends. One group very much committed to having a treaty on this, as per the traditional approach, including at the CD, because this PPWT treaty has been laying there on the table at the CD since 2008, and the issue is even older. So that's the traditional kind of disarmament or arms control approach, a treaty legally binding, etc. But the norms, as a means of perhaps achieving success more rapidly and increasing the chances of agreement in such a difficult and fraught discussions and issues, mirrored in a series of geopolitical considerations and strategies. I think the norms, that's what guided the cybersecurity GGE. And in that case, the fact that we were discussing norms of responsible state behavior in the cyberspace made agreement not easy, but at least viable, as the outcome proved. We did get a consensus on 18 pages worth of agreements. I think quite substantial, though not a legally binding treaty, but I think very meaningful in any case, because it's an agreement achieved by the major competing powers in that domain, alongside other countries who are also participating, and then the full membership of the UN rallied round and thought that was meaningful and representative of very important consensus. So the General Assembly endorsed that outcome, even though the outcome was not an inclusive outcome. It was an outcome amongst 25 members of the GGE. So for the OEWG now, it's inclusive of all, so makes perhaps in one way it's more difficult because the full membership is there discussing this. On the other hand, it's a different process from a GGE. You don't really get in-depth discussions because everybody has to speak. There's a time limit. There's a limit in opportunities for meeting. It's a more open-ended procedure, so people also tend to speak as formal delegations. They're not in a closed room speaking as experts with freedom to go and test positions and then come back to their original ones, so on and so forth. On the other hand, the fact that the mandate of the OEWG is framed in the terms of norms, a bit like the cyber GG, norms, rules, and principles, so you're not right now aiming directly at elements for a treaty or for a legally binding instrument, I think increases the chances of some useful outcomes and agreements. That's my perception. So the OEWG offers a way forward for an issue of extreme relevance. I think it's a pity that in the past we had such difficulties getting this subject moving along, because it's extremely important. So another difference is that now I think the focus is on the threats. There's a quite deliberate indication there that members of the OEWG should discuss threats. And I think threat perception is extremely important. In the GGE, we were looking for elements of a treaty, so we discussed threats, but we were not just focused on threats. We were trying to find elements for the treaties, and treaties have many things in addition to threats. It has principles, then it has a preamble, then it has hardcore obligations, which was a bit of a stumbling block. So when you're discussing elements for a treaty, you're discussing also obligations for states, legally binding obligations. In the case of norms, you don't have to go that far. So I think it's a less perhaps ambitious step, but could be a fundamentally important first step if we are to arrive at any agreements on these norms. The fact that you don't discuss treaty obligations as such also means that you don't have to get very much into issues of definition, which are another stumbling block. It's very difficult to get agreement on certain definitions. If you're discussing elements for a full-blown treaty, at some point you will have to define the terms of the treaty, especially those that are in the obligation part. If you're discussing norms of responsible behavior, you can describe the behaviors that you want to shape in positive or negative terms, refraining from doing something or always doing something in a certain way that is the responsible way of doing. And you don't need that much to get into definition of terms, because it's not really a legal treaty, a complete legal treaty. So I think that's also an opportunity for greater progress to be made there. Again, I think everybody mentions responsible behavior. I think the word states, sometimes it's missing. It doesn't appear right out in the resolution, but later when there are the points that the OEWG needs to address, then it's written relating to threats by states to space systems. So it's, I think the subject of discussion is clearly and foremost the states. I know that many people feel, just like in the cyber discussions, that private sector has kind of taken over in certain ways. They own, in the virtual world, they own the infrastructure upon which the internet and everything else kind of works. 80% is owned by private companies. In outer space, private entities are beginning to also increase their presence in states in outer space. But here, it's a first committee resolution, and I think the focus is on the states because it's a kind of a geopolitical, we're looking at peace and security. And I think the norms could say many things about the behavior of private sector as well, but the states need to take some responsibilities for whatever the private sector does. So even if you recommend a certain behavior that involves the private sector acting a certain way, I think each state will be responsible for encouraging or trying to discipline private sector behavior in such a fashion. So I don't know if I'm already reaching the end. 9 minutes. Okay, I need to start wrapping up. I could go forever in this. Again, another aspect, as you can see, though I think as Brazil and myself, I have other kinds of positions, but I think norms, rules, and principles of responsible behavior is kind of a new trend that proved to be positive in cybersecurity discussions. I think it may be helpful also for outer space discussions, even though things are not exactly the same. In outer space, you do have a series of existing treaties, international law applicable to outer space. You didn't have those for cyber discussions. So I think whatever norms, rules, and principles that you add to outer space to make outer space less prone to conflict and misinterpretations and threats to peace, I think these norms need to be fully respectful of and compatible with the existing treaties, because it's not realistic to renegotiate the existing treaties. They've been there. They're very solid, even though they are general. But it needs this backwards compatibility with the treaties. It needs to be perfectly respectful of the UN Charter and applicable international law. But it can go beyond. It can be extremely helpful. And I think the way discussions are framed, possibly in a sequential manner, you're not trying to please those who want a treaty and those who want norms together, as we tried to do in the GGE, and that proved to be difficult. But now you can kind of focus on the norms first as a stepping stone towards something else, towards possibly in the future a binding instrument. It's not incompatible one thing with the other. The norms actually, sometimes when you read them and look at them, they could be an integral part of a treaty. It's not that different, but they are not formatted as such. So that's my optimistic view on the current mandate and on the possibilities for the OEWG. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Patriota, for opening the panel with really such a wonderful way of also summing up where we stand. With this, I'd like to give the floor to our next speaker, Mr. Z, to also please provide us with your general views on the topic we're here to discuss, namely, how can space security be achieved?
Thank you, and it's a pleasure to join this panel. I think the solutions to achieving space security should be based on the full and objective understanding of the threats we face related to outer space. There are two major types of challenges now. Firstly, with the dissemination and development of the space technology and more actors entering into space, the space witnesses increasing debris, more congested orbits, and deteriorating environment. These are the safety challenges faced by humanity in the process of space exploration and development. Secondly, the rapid development of space technology also leads to increasing military application and, even worse, the weaponization of outer space, with the outer space increasingly being regarded as a new battlefield. These are the biggest threats to space security and deserve more attention from international community, at least in the Geneva track. The root cause of the latter type of threats or challenges is that certain space powers keep advancing space dominance strategy at the expense of other countries' security interests and global strategic stability. The space power openly declare outer space as a war-fighting domain, speed up its space military structuring and offensive and defensive capability build-up, induce and coerce private sectors to assist in space military activities, and establish space military alliance by conducting operational exercises, etc. If these dangerous trends go on unchecked, space conflicts might become true in the future, and the consequence would be disastrous. Generally speaking, we think that currently there are three approaches with regard to addressing the threats and challenges and safeguarding space security. The first one is the negotiation on the legally binding instrument. This is the mainstream view, I would say, of the international community. Since 1981, the UN has adopted resolutions every year with an overwhelming majority, reaffirming the importance and the urgency of preventing an arms race in outer space. We call it PAROS, requesting the Conference on Disarmament to start negotiation. This reflects the strong will of the international community. China has long been calling for negotiation on the legally binding instrument and submitted the PPWT together with Russia. This draft reflects the acknowledgement of the most pressing threat to space security and is in line with the common aspiration of the international community for PAROS. This draft aims at preventing weaponization of an arms race in outer space by not just prohibiting a certain type of weapon, but in a more comprehensive manner, prohibiting placement of any weapons in outer space and prohibiting the threat or use of force against outer space objects, be it from land, sea, or outer space. The dual-use nature of space technology and the complexity of possible space weapons are also taken into consideration when defining the hardcore obligations in the PPWT. So the prohibition is not targeting a capability per se, but the action to be taken and the result of such action, which could be tracked and verified with the current technology, including space situation awareness. The draft reflects the CD member states' joint efforts in the past more than 20 years brings on board suggestions and proposals from many other parties and provides a practical option for a legally binding instrument. But this is an open draft. We welcome any constructive suggestions and revisions so long as they help to achieve the goal of PAROS and safeguarding the space security. The other two approaches, I would say, are transparency and confidence building measures, TCBM, and the responsible behavior approach, which is also TCBM in nature. These voluntary measures could play a positive role in increasing mutual trust, reducing misjudgment, and maintaining space security. They could be pushed forward together with a legally binding instrument and reinforce each other. However, we oppose the lopsided or the partial approach to use TCBM as a distraction or even rejecting the necessity and feasibility of the legally binding instrument. From a historical perspective, no arms control or disarmament in any areas could be achieved just by voluntary measures. So these measures cannot substitute the legally binding instrument and should not become a precondition for its negotiation. During the 20th National Congress of the CPC, General Secretary Xi Jinping emphasizes that China has always been committed to its foreign policy goals of upholding world peace and promoting common development, and it is dedicated to promoting a human community with a shared future. To safeguard the security of outer space and to promote its peaceful use is fully in line with this vision. China will uphold the vision of global governance featuring extensive consultation, joint contribution and shared benefits, actively implement the Global Development Initiative and Global Security Initiative, and push for new progress on space security governance and negotiation of a legally binding instrument together with other countries, so as to contribute to space security and a better future for humankind. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ji, for these opening remarks. And I'll now give the floor to Mr. Belousov, also to hear you on your initial general views on the topic of this panel, how can space security be achieved? Over to you, Mr. Belousov.
Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers of this conference for inviting me as a panel speaker. So it is an honor and a pleasure to be here and to speak in front of such honorable audience. So it is generally recognized that the use of space technologies is currently one of the drivers of economic and technological development. With the wide exploitation of space technologies, individual countries and the entire humankind now grow more dependent on space. This state of affairs determines one of the main tasks or questions of our time. It is how to preserve the space for exclusively peaceful purposes. This task is not new. As it stood before the United Nations member states since the second half of the last century, it has since the beginning of the space age. During the first 25 years of it, from 1955 to 1980, international space law evolved from resolutions and declarations adopted by the UN General Assembly to consolidation of the rules, norms, and principles of use of outer space enshrined in those documents in international treaties. It is obvious that the states that drafted these treaties and the states that joined them later proceeded from the fact that legally binding instruments are the most effective instruments for international regulation of space activities and for ensuring their equal, non-discriminatory, and conflict-free implementation. However, the evolving nature of space activities themselves, emergence of new technological solutions in the use of outer space, expansion of the range of tasks that are currently being resolved with the help of space technologies, as well as the emergence of new participants in space activities, have predetermined the evolution of mechanisms and instruments for international regulation of space activities. Currently, various options are being offered to address specific practical problems related to the use of outer space. In addition to the set legally binding instruments and principles and declarations which I mentioned, they include such instruments as guidelines, transparency and confidence building measures, codes of conduct, and last but not least, the norms and rules of responsible behavior. It is obvious that the set instruments should play a supporting role to legally binding instruments and rely on the current international space law, and in the first row on the cornerstone document, the Outer Space Treaty of 1967. Moreover, these instruments, given their voluntary or political binding nature, should have specific application purposes, pursue specific goals which are defined and agreed upon by all interested parties. This very approach was used in the development of the principles on artificial Earth satellites for international direct television broadcasting, the remote sensing principles relevant to the use of nuclear power sources in outer space, the guidelines on the long-term sustainability of outer space activities. However, a disputable issue remains whether this tool set can be used to resolve the problem of preventing an arms race in outer space. The Russian Federation is convinced that the whole range of issues related to solving this task can be tackled only within the framework of a new legally binding instrument. That is why Russia, together with China, initiated a treaty on the prevention of the placement of weapons in outer space and use the force and threat of force against space objects. Specifically, the approach of the Russian Federation involves the following commitments that could be included in the future treaty on PAROS. The first one, not to use space objects as a means of destroying any targets on Earth, in the air, or outer space. Second, not to create, test, or deploy weapons in space to perform any tasks, including for anti-missile defense, anti-satellite activity, or use against targets on Earth or in the air, and to eliminate such systems that the states already possess. Third one, not to create, test, deploy, or use space weapons for anti-missile defense, anti-satellite activity, or use against targets on Earth or in the air. Fourth, not to destroy, damage, or disrupt the normal functioning and not to change the flight paths of space objects owned by other states. Fifth, not to assist to encourage other states to participate in the above mentioned activities. So other instruments such as confidence building and transparency measures in outer space activities, or certain principles and rules of responsible behavior could serve a supplementary role to the possible treaty on PAROS. It is the same role that the documents already adopted to implement the provisions of the existing legally binding instruments and agreements play nowadays. Unilateral and collective initiatives aimed at solving various tasks to prevent the transformation of outer space into a zone for an armed confrontation between states should be attributed to the tools that could help solving the task of the Paris Treaty. In this regard, I would like to remind you about the Russian initiative on no first placement of weapons in outer space, which has already been joined by 30 states. It is important to note that when it comes to solving the task of PAROS, it is important that all agreements and obligations contained in them made by states respond to quite real, not imaginary threats. At the same time, the list of such threats should not be obtained through unilateral or narrow group analysis, but rather should result from a review of the situation in outer space with the participation of all UN member states. This is primarily the practical benefit of the open-ended working group on reducing space threats through norms, rules, and principles of responsible behaviors. However, our principled stance remains unchanged. Addressing the goal of preventing an arms race in outer space can be achieved only through development of a legally binding instrument that would eliminate possible threats on both space objects from space and from Earth, as well as object and infrastructure from space and Earth. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Belousov. And then I'll give the floor to Dr. Pascoe, please, for your introductory remarks.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Chairman. I'm very happy to be here with you for this very timely event on the present, future efforts and practical measures for PAROS. And would like just make a few remarks, and a lot of things have been said, including this morning. I will repeat. First, a broad remark from my perspective and from a security perspective about the evolution of space. It seems to be marked by two main features. One is our societies have become more and more dependent on space for their activities, been said, for their security, for their defense. And this dependence is only growing. And second, space and transformation of space environment has been accelerating over all these years. It's due to the accelerating pace of space technologies, and also it's due to the evolution of information technologies, and space is getting closer. Space and information technologies are getting closer to each other, and it's creating a new dynamics in space, and that the international community should, I think, better measure this this dynamics, based on this relationship that is getting closer and closer. We have more and more objects in space. They are performing maneuvers. They are performing new functions, including in the military domain, and we see a number of those. And we have an increased diversity of players in space. So I think that it's been suggested this morning by Ambassador Lagos, by the way. I think it's important that diplomacy is not outpaced by the technology and by industry. And this is really clear that these debates that we have here are very important, and what's going on at the UN level is, of course, very, very important. So for states are facing quite a paradoxical situation. They're becoming more and more dependent on an environment that is less and less predictable, more and more uncertain. And this is something of a contradictory effect that needs to be considered carefully. One consequence, we have seen many consequences, it's been mentioned, the rise of consolidated military organizations. We have had successive anti-satellite experiments signaling some sort of a show of force, at least symbolically, but that's very important on the international stage. And the course is kept like this, it will certainly negatively impact our common space environment. And this environment, by the way, today is already largely affected by debris. And this would create a situation that would rather call for greater cooperation instead of this kind of evolution. It calls for cooperation, it calls also for transparency, and I refer to the TCBMs that have been also underlined by Mr. G. Greater transparency here may be the key word. It has appeared in the 90s in space and the UN context. And whether it would be applied to encourage activities, to authorize activities, even to prohibit activities, this increased transparency would deal with the level of transparency for space activities, an increased level of information to all, established rules of behaviors, we have mentioned that. And this has led to seminal works. We mentioned DG, the DG report in 2030 was kind of an interesting work with results pointing out the necessity to exchange information on space policy, mentioning notification, pre-notification, on-site visit.
the 2 days work, and has been also mentioned this morning, about known rules and principles and responsible behaviors going in this direction. It's a better, greater collective awareness on the risk posed by the absence of these discussions and exchanges. We need to envision renewed mechanism to promote exchanges on space activities and create collective interaction. I think this is really an important, pragmatic, concrete way of seeing things. The priority should be given to mitigating the risk of misunderstandings. It's also be said this should be really seen as a key objective for us all. The challenge is high as space activity have become more and more critical. So the discussions, of course, need to be deeper. And with regards to the required steps to build such an instrument for space, and I would like to insist here on this aspect, we can see some interesting example with some existing instruments in other domains, and I would like to mention here the Hague Code of Conduct against ballistic missile proliferation. It's a multilateral instrument that has been in existence to this year for 30 years. It's been initiated in 1992 with 92 signatory countries. In 2022, it has 143 signatory countries. And this is a very light instrument, and sometimes it's almost seen as a weakness. It's a light instrument that talks about pre-notification, very light pre-notification about space launch vehicles test or missile test. It talks about annual declaration about activities in this respect. It also envisioned some optional on-site visits, for example. This is something that's been existing. I think the most important thing is not so much these different options I mentioned, these different features of the Hague Code. The most important is that it's, in the end, constitutes some sort of a platform where people can talk to each other, where people can interact, even in an informal manner. And I think this is something that is perceived in a very positive way by a number of countries. And by the way, those countries, among these signatory countries, of course, very few of them possess ballistic missiles or space launcher. Most of them don't possess that, but they feel the need for being part of this community because the tendency in this domain affects the whole international community. I think this is something that we could inspire from in the space domain. I don't mean that we need to reinvent some sort of a regime like this, but we need to be certainly pragmatic. We must have high expectations in terms of legal framework, but we have to process, I think, in a prosaic and pragmatic manner. And I think this is interesting to know about this mechanism that exists in a very sensitive domain, by the way, and that in fact has proven its usefulness, I would say, to share information. So I think talking about space today is also talking about transparency, it's talking about TCBMs, talking about mutual confidence. And I think we have to look at all the existing mechanisms that can be harnessed and used for promoting this kind of transparency. I will stop here.
Thank you, Dr. Pascoe. Thank you very much. And I'll give now the floor to Dr. West, please, also to give us your view about how can space security be achieved. Thank you.
Hi, thank you for having me. I love being on a panel that talks about the past, present, and future of PAROS, prevention of an arms race in outer space, because I've spent the last year and a bit diving into both the past and the future of this initiative. I had the kind of crazy idea in retrospect of putting together a timeline on arms control in space as a tool to help us diplomatically. I thought it would be easy, and it was not. There's a lot. We've been working on these issues and talking about them since really the 1950s, the late 1950s. PAROS comes in the 1980s, and there's been a flurry of activity. I think there's a sense that we haven't been doing much on this, but there have been at least 3 GGEs, treaty proposals, so many working papers, I probably left some of them out, numerous resolutions, efforts at TCBMs. There's been a lot of activity, and yet we find ourselves today faced with a space environment that continues to have deteriorating security. And so what do we make of this effort and activity on the one hand, and in some cases, a lack of concrete progress on the other, a lack of progress that enhances the security of the space environment? And I think it's important to point out that today voting is going to take place, I believe, this afternoon on First Committee on Outer Space Resolutions. And there are two important strands of resolutions on the floor today, one dealing with a moratorium on the testing of anti-satellite weapons that are ground-based, and one dealing with placement of weapons in space. And when you look back, those are the same two resolutions that were on the floor in 1981. Slightly different forms, but same issues, same topics. And so how do we get past a point when we're having not one conversation, but two conversations in some ways that keep talking past one another and going in circles? And so I've written rather a long report on lessons that we can learn from other domains of activities that can help us move forward. You can find it online or come see me after. It's really long, so I'm not going to go through all the points in it here. But I think the key point I want to make is it's time to modernize PAROS. You know, we put a lot of effort into modernizing weapons and into modernizing defense strategies and concepts such as deterrence. We should at least put that much effort into modernizing our approaches to peace and to arms control. And I think that there are several ways in which we can do this. And they're focused really on making PAROS more inclusive, on breaking open the box that we've been held in for a really long time, and thinking creatively and bringing in more issues and more actors. And I think a key place to start with this modernization and this inclusion is with the principles and objectives of PAROS. We heard from Izumi today that the key issues are really about non-weaponization and non-use of force in outer space, but that's kind of abstract. And our approach has really been rooted in kind of an old school Cold War strategic stability perspective, and that's not wrong. Those are important objectives. But space and arms control in space are about so much more than that. And I think here we can really learn from other areas of arms control where we've seen progress, but that progress is driven by people and planet, by concerns for people and for the planet. So we have the TPNW on nuclear weapons. We have a new political declaration on explosive weapons. These are driven in many ways by feminist and gender-based perspectives and a human concern. And I think we can bring that human concern to space, or rather bring space security back down to Earth, if you will. Space is about the environment. Space includes elements of human security and humanitarian protection. Space includes elements of sustainable development. And I think by rooting some of our arms control discussions in these broader human interests, we can find common ground that might elude us at a strategic level. So I have hope in that approach, and I think it's starting to resonate. I think we're seeing movement on the moratorium on anti-satellite testing, in part because it is about weapons, but it's not just about weapons. It's also about access to space. It's also about environmental sustainability. It's also about sustainable development for everyone. Scope. I think we can modernize the scope of PAROS. It doesn't mean displacing the focus on arms control, but we also have to think about the many different capabilities that are involved in potential use of force and armed conflict today. We're going to hear about that tomorrow, but it's not the same as it was in the 1980s. It's much more diverse, and so we need to think in some ways more broadly about the scope of arms control, but also more specifically in some ways. How do we maintain peace? How do we maintain the conditions to prevent arms in space, to prevent states from pursuing armament in outer space? And to me, some of this is about removing the fog of peace, as I call it. Peaceful purposes is fundamental in space, but everything is called peaceful. Even weapons tests are often referred to in the language of peaceful uses. And so how do we distinguish peaceful from non-peaceful uses? We don't talk about this. And that's in line with how do we distinguish responsible from irresponsible behaviors? How do we distinguish commercial and civilian applications from more harmful applications? And it's the how and the how do we know that I think we need to start working on so that we can sustain peace in outer space. And then finally, I think we need to invest. We need to invest in peace and diplomacy. Many of you would be familiar with my colleague Paul Meyer. He is well known for his kind of disgust, really, with the fact that there's no annual meeting of states parties to the Outer Space Treaty. The problem is really much broader than that. We don't have a lot of diplomatic and peaceful machinery associated with outer space governance. And this is a topic coming up at the OEWG quite frequently. We need ways of communicating. We need ways of exchanging information. We need ways of deconflicting, ways of consulting, and they need to be inclusive so that all states can be a part of them. And so that investment, I think, is also part of greater inclusivity. So how do we get there? I think it's really important to change the politics of engagement on space. It's been kind of stable for a long time, but stable in a way that's not progressing. I like that, as Xavier was talking about, the HCOC, the Hague Code of Conduct, is sort of this platform for often informal exchanges, but for open conversation and dialogue, rather than very formal statements that end up talking past one another. I think inclusivity also means bringing in other stakeholders. We've heard today about the huge role that industry plays. Civil society also plays a role. So finding new spaces, I think, for dialogue and exchange, even off the record, finding new ways to engage more stakeholders, I think that inclusivity is really key for breaking the logjam that we find ourselves in. And I'm optimistic because I know not everyone is in love with the OEWG, but a lot of these strands of conversation are coming up in the discussion. We're talking about mechanisms. We're talking about the how do we know part of space security. And I think from this discussion, we might have a lot of opportunities to pursue many different avenues of progress. So I would leave you with the idea that, to me, PAROS is not one thing. PAROS is not a single agreement on a piece of paper. PAROS is many things, and going forward, we're going to have to achieve many things in space. We are going to need rules. We need solid norms to inform those rules. We need new mechanisms, new ways of engagement, and we might have different sets of rules for different kinds of activities. But we really need a broader security regime for outer space, and not a small box of PAROS, but sort of a wider community of PAROS, if you will. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. West. And with these 5 statements that we certainly have been mapping a number of the past initiatives and also some of the current challenges that we're facing. So I would like, as with just over half an hour left for this panel, I'll put a question to you, Ambassador Patriota. You did refer and explain really how the GGE on PAROS had been working and some of the challenges and already identified some of the possible way forward. But maybe, you also indicated that you have your own views, and in light of your great experience there, what do you think are the lessons that we should really learn from the past, and where would you see the opportunities moving forward, the places where we can, in fact, reinforce transparency and move forward?
I think it's very difficult to try and achieve both.
I tried to sort of hint at that.
I think on the one hand, the opportunity of on the other, more flexible. A treaty can contain norms to begin with, they're not exactly along the lines of the norms, and it's been proven that there is a good starting point, quite substantial distance between the two groups of countries that defend one and the other as options for moving forward. I think they're not exactly the same exercise, and it's been proven that there is a quite substantial distance between the two groups of countries that defend one and the other as options for moving forward. I think the issue of discussing threats instead of just jumping into a treaty and the treaty obligations and what it contains and not to do this, this, and that, I think we need to have a conversation that starts looking at what are the real threats. And I think one of the threats is the absence of any agreement for such a long period of time. I think that's a huge threat because things are not improving, they're worsening, everybody's in agreement. And the fact that we can't agree on anything because a treaty is wonderful, but there's no agreement on a treaty. This treaty has been lying around for many, many, many years, and the prospects of getting it moving today are no better than it was 15 years ago or even further back. So, I mean, the fact that we have a draft, in the GG, we try to kind of reshape a bit the draft. Yes, the draft is open for some contributions. That was an attempt that was made at length in the GGE. I thought we could almost get there, but in the end we didn't, unfortunately. So I think the treaty is, right now, it's very ambitious. I don't see convergence over a treaty. But I think maybe if the treaty is not discarded as an endgame sort of proposition, I think treaties are ideal. I believe in international law, but it needs to be agreed to. So in the meantime, it would be useful if we could agree on things that are a bit lesser than a treaty, but perhaps reachable, where you don't have to really get to the nitty-gritty of definitions and things like that, and obligations. Even there was a reference to no first use, how important that is as a commitment, but that's not a treaty, no first use. No first use is much more along the lines of what is a responsible behavior. It's responsible not to be the one to use it first. And then you adopt a kind of a unilateral self-commitment not to first use. That's not a treaty. And still, it's perceived as something very important. Those who have supported, and Brazil has supported, the no first use resolution, they are taking on a commitment. It's a political commitment. It's not a treaty obligation. It's not legally binding as such. So I think, and that's useful. So why wouldn't a set of very complex norms, that would go beyond just confidence building measures, transparency, it could go beyond that. Why wouldn't that, if the major countries can agree to that, and the rest of the international community find that that's useful, and that's balanced, and that's important, and it's compatible with international law, with the UN Charter, with everything else, with the Outer Space CG, why wouldn't that be a great breakthrough? I think it would. I think the absence of any new rule, of any additional element beyond the 1967 Space Treaty, which is very general in nature, really is a threat in and of itself. So that would be my view.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Thank you. We have already several questions coming up in the room, so I will take 2 questions at a time, and then we'll revert to the panel. So I'll start first with Mr. Hughes, please. And please, if you may, introduce yourself briefly as well before you ask your questions. Thank you.
Yeah, my name's Clive Hughes. I'm with the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office in the United Kingdom, working on space security issues. So I was, thanks to all the panelists for their remarks. I was particularly interested in the comment by Ambassador Patriota about his comparison of the GGE and the OEWG and the pros and cons of these different approaches. And he identified one of the strengths of the GGE as a kind of bringing together as experts, in-depth conversations, being able to sort of test out different positions without being sort of rigid about your sort of national frameworks and so on. So I was just wondering, in that GGE, what sort of conversations were had on the issue of verification, and how did those go, and were there any particular sort of observations you have on that particular issue?
Thank you. I'll take another question, and then we'll give back the floor. Rajagopalan, please.
Thank you, Cecil. And it's a terrific panel. Looked at a number of different past efforts. I agree entirely with Ambassador Patriota when he says that I think the absence of any international agreement is the biggest challenge today, because I think the lack of consensus, the ability to create consensus among the major powers has become the biggest stumbling block in developing any sort of agreement, whether it is a political agreement or a legally binding agreement. But I think the Russian colleague Andrei and others tend to kind of give us the impression that treaties are like the magic bullet. It's going to remove all the problems that we are encountering, the challenges that we encounter in the space security domain. Treaties do not give us any guarantee that it's going to bring in good behavior from states. So what is it that treaties give you? Because treaties have been broken, treaty commitments have been broken in the past, and the historical record doesn't really stack up well for those who make a case for treaties and legally binding agreements. So what is the Russia-China insistence on treaties as the way to go about, and why not look at political agreements as a starting place, because the current international political climate does not really sit well for coming to an agreement on legally binding agreements, forget about anything else. So I think it could be a good starting point if we can take the baby step of building commitment towards a political agreement at this stage. Thank you.
Thank you. And so first, maybe actually Ambassador Patriota, if you want to start with the first questions, and then I'll also give the floor to the other panelists.
Okay, well, difficult question. Verification is usually an element in arms control treaties, the formal treaties, because they set obligations that are legally binding for states, and whether you comply or you violate those obligations needs to be verified. So that's a very important point in typical arms control treaty. verification would not necessarily be required in the same way if you're dealing with this under the framework of norms, rules, and principles of responsible behavior. Then there would be kind of a peer review, if you want, mechanism where states could monitor each other with their resources or collective resources or regional resources. You have a lot of regional organizations, and you could have a kind of a looser type of mutual follow-up as to how countries are doing in terms of such responsibility, whether they're being responsible or not. So there's a kind of it's not ideal, but many systems do work on that basis. It's better than no basis. Verification is also an element that was raised by the group of countries that right now do not wish to have an internationally legally binding treaty, because they claim that as you cannot verify what countries are doing or the intent of countries by sending satellites in orbit, whether because of dual use issues and all of that, and the insufficiency of means to really know what's going on and what the intent is, and even situational awareness is not as precise and real time as you would like it to be. So since things are not completely verifiable, taking on legally binding obligations under a treaty would be meaningless, would be not the way to go. So it's an argument against the treaty, basically. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Belousov, you were mentioned, if you want to.
Okay.
Please.
Thank you very much. It was very interesting question from my Indian colleague. Well, thank you for this question. Actually, it is not the right understanding that the Russian Federation is against any other instruments instead of besides the legally binding instrument. We are ready to work in parallel on any instruments that could lead to us to the solutions of the whole complex of PAROS issues. So, and that's why we participated in the work on the International Code of Conduct in outer space activities, for outer space activities. We participated in the GG on TCBMs. We participate in the open-ended working group on responsible behavior. So all these fora, all these platforms are useful in some aspects. Definitely. But once again, I would like to stress that we consider legally binding instruments as the most effective instruments for solving problems in the sphere of arms control, disarmament, and non-proliferation. In our understanding, definitely, you're absolutely right. Nothing can guarantee 400% safety, security, and exclusively peaceful use of outer space. So it is understandable. But, we suppose that the fundamental for the international regulation of outer space activities and the foundation for the providing security and enhancing security in outer space should be the legally binding instrument. On PAROS, we are not talking about something exceptional, something new, something going beyond the existing frameworks for the arms control and non-proliferation and disarmament. We suppose that, as Ms. West mentioned, we should tackle the old painful aspects of the PAROS with the traditional means, actually, with the legally binding instruments. Of course, I agree fully with Ms. West that we should, at some stage, look at the PAROS with new eyes, so to say, to think about it in comparing it with the reality, with the new conditions in outer space, with new understanding of the security, international security, and so on and so forth. But doing this, we should not forget about old problems which we had since the beginning of the space age, actually. So, and one of the problems is the possibility of placement of weapons in outer space. That will be the game changer for the outer space security, definitely. So that's why we suggest to focus on this issue first of all, because in our opinion, it solves about 80% of the problems with the PAROS in outer space. But once again, we are ready to work on any proposals that could lead us to the resolution of the task of PAROS. It could be ICOC, it could be principles and norms of responsible behavior, it could be TCBMs. But once again, first of all, they should be in compliance with the existing international law, specifically with the Outer Space Treaty of 1967. The second, they should be elaborated by all interested countries and agreed upon by all interested countries, first of all, by the spacefaring nations. So without it, any instrument will be weak, will be ineffective, will be for nothing. So the third criteria, in my opinion, it should address real threats, not imaginary threats in outer space. They should address the real problems in outer space. And the list of these problems, the list of these threats should be again elaborated not by one country or by a small group of countries, but by all the international community. That will pave our way to the successful resolution of the PAROS issues. Thanks. I'll stop here.
Thank you. Mr. G, yes?
Thank you. If I may add something, I think with regard to the fact that there's no agreement so far on the possible treaty, I think the root cause is that some superpower is not willing to accept any constraints on its capability and on its liberty of wielding military powers and on its liberty of seeking absolute advantage. I think that is the main problem, but it is not a fact that we should take for granted and we should accept as it is. That is why we need to push forward, we continue pushing forward for the negotiation of legally binding instrument. And also the second point regarding the legally binding document is a silver bullet. We don't think either, the legally binding document would be a silver bullet. But what is important is that a legally binding document is kind of to establish a taboo and a clear legal obligation to define. And of course, we do not reject any other measures to complement with the legally binding document, but the very key requirement now, I think, is a legally binding document at this moment. Thank you.
Thank you. And Dr. West?
Yes. So I think my point about modernizing PAROS is the idea that we can tackle old problems with new approaches and new ways of thinking and new ways of doing politics. But I do want to stress that norms are not less than, at least not in my opinion. They're not the easy way out. Norms are hard. all agreements are hard. And I will direct you to the report that Almudena and I wrote last year on norms, specifically in the context of PAROS and legally binding agreements. But I think it's important to point out that we need norms. No matter what else happens, we really have to solidify the norms of behavior in outer space. They're at the heart of arms control. Most agreements codify existing norms of non-use or strategic stability or humanitarian protection. And so what are the key values and principles that we want at the heart of our regime in outer space? That's part of norm development, and that's the taboo part to me. That is also the, what do we not want to see in space? That should be part of a normative discussion. But having a shared understanding of how we are going to operate in space, of what we expect from others, and of what we will in turn provide to others in our own behaviors is absolutely essential to be able to maintain any sense of sustainability and safety in space, but also security. We need that to maintain the ability to have peace in outer space, to avoid conflict escalation. And so I don't see them as trade-offs, I suppose. I see them as deeply linked. And when you think about norms and law, norms are not separate from. They are embedded in a legal context. Norms tell you how the law is practiced. What does the law look like when we're applying it? And I guess I don't see such a dichotomy, and I would like us to move a little bit past the either-or discussion. I know we can't maybe do both in one single process. I mean, diplomats are human, and there are limits to what you can do. But this is part of the point that there are many tools that we need. They're not trade-offs, they're not either-ors, they're ands, if you will. I'll just leave it at that. But norms do constrain behavior. Norms are a constraint. So I think it's important for me to explain that.
Dr. Pascoe?
Yes, very quickly, I hear this debate between norms and legally binding text. I just want to stress a sense of urgency that we need to find practical measures, especially based on transparency building and confidence building measures that are actually operational and that can be operated so that we can collectively address very urgent issue that will become more and more present in space because of the pace, again, because of the accelerated pace of technology and what we're going to do in space, how we're going to use space. In 5 years from now, the use space will have completely changed compared to what we experience today. So I think I just wanted to stress this so that we keep this in mind also in this debate.
Thank you. All right, we have several questions, both in the room in Geneva and also online. So clearly the discussions and the panel is generating a lot of interest. Let's take one question online from Guoyu Wang, who says, a future effort and practical measure must be taken, which unfortunately has not been taken in various UN bodies. It is to seek for common recognition of the applicability of specific principles, rules of lex lata to specific space security scenarios. Political will is a decisive element for achieving a PAROS solution, but such political will cannot be promoted only through political discussions. Thus, compared with the ongoing responsible/irresponsible political debates, the legal debates might be more urgent. If so, how would the UN bodies take an action to organize such legal discussion to establish another OEWG or GGE, or incorporate this to the existing OEWG? And Guoyu Wang also indicated this is for all panelists and thanking us. So long questions, but I'll also take two more questions from the room in order. I had first Mrs. Mine, please.
I'll have mine of the One Goal Initiative question to the representative from Brazil, Mr. Guilherme de Aguiar Patriota. How can an entity that heavily depends on another regulate the latter? Mind you, this is a hard problem, I'm aware of it, and this is really in the genuine spirit of looking for a solution.
Thank you. So with a question specifically addressed to Ambassador Patriota. And Ms. Asfour, please.
I'm Cyrine Asfour, so I'm a student with an international relations and law background and the co-founder of the Swiss Space Law Forum, which addresses the space issues here in Switzerland. And I feel like we're doing the same mistake again in terms of addressing the space issues with a limited point of view. And here I'm referring to geographical presence in this conference, and to be 100% transparent, I'm referring to Africa. Where is Morocco? Where is Nigeria? Where is South Africa? Where is Algeria? Where is Kenya? Where is Egypt? If not mistaken, none of the African region are represented during your 2 days conference, when some of their countries already addressed space issues in their national laws. And why are not them asking their position on space security?
I think we understand the essence of your question in terms of inclusivity and representation. Thank you. I'll turn back to Ambassador Patriota first with you, and also maybe if you can refer again to the question of inclusion and inclusivity that you had already mentioned before. Thank you.
These have also reached a bit of an exhaustion in certain ways because of the lack of inclusivity. So there's only so much you can do under the GGE format. I think we need a breakthrough, and issues are difficult, and you don't get any breakthrough after years of attempting to have them with the full membership of the UN or the whole international community. Sometimes it's nice to try and see if you can get with the major, especially when you're dealing with geostrategic discussions with the major powers who have the most capabilities to do these things. So if they can agree to something, I think the rest can understand that this agreement is important and rally around the agreement, but it's difficult. Sometimes not even in a small room you get the agreement. How can an entity regulate another? I'm not sure I understood the question. I think here what's behind all this discussion is just not norms per se or treaties per se or legal new laws per se. We're trying to regulate a reality of unequal balances of power. So some countries have capabilities that others don't. Some country can do more things than others, not only in terms of offensive military capabilities, but also in terms of controlling what others are doing and verifying what they're doing. So the regulating of others issue is really based on capacities. And countries with less capacities will have more difficulties to control and regulate what others are doing. But if you have an agreed standard set of norms and rules of behavior, at least you know what you're regulating and on the basis of what. At least you have an agreement. So this is the standard. This is what countries should or should not do. If they're not doing this, then I have a legitimacy to call them out. And if you're very powerful, you can not only call them out, but you can actually try and do something about it. You can try to raise some sort of sanctions against them and all sorts of things. So there's an issue of also of legitimacy behind all this. And I think norms, when they're agreed to by all, they carry a lot of weight in and of their own right, whether or not they're legally binding. So that's what we're aiming for, I think. It's a consensus, the strength of consensus. So in that sense, I agree, all should be there, not only spacefaring nations. I don't think it should be the sole decision-making power of spacefaring nations. I think all should be involved, not only states, even though right now the discussions are for states and the obligations are aiming at states, but the consequences will not be limited to states. So I think everybody should pitch in, should be allowed to have a say. How to do that? It's difficult to do it in a UN format. I've been an advocate for improving on UN formats and making them more accessible to third-party contributions, civil society, academia, etc., private sector. It's easier said than done. When you get to General Assembly rules of procedure, then you find that there's a wall against that, and many countries will uphold that wall. And it's been very difficult to break it down. But of course, there are indirect ways of doing. That's what we're doing here, for example, with Unity and other kinds of, meetings.
Thank you, Ambassador. I'm turning to the other panelists to know if anyone would like to address these issues, including the first question, which was also whether we should, if I summarize it, whether we should leave it to lawyers to negotiate. Mr.
Thank you. I just wanted to respond to the question about legal discussions, actually. First of all, I would like to stress that legal discussions are going on in the framework of the PAROS. So there is the specific subcommittee, the legal subcommittee, which considers a lot of legal issues connected with the outer space activities. So some benefits were given by the open-ended working group on responsible behavior, because the first session of this format was devoted specifically to the legal issues. It was a kind of the review of the existing international space law, and there were a lot of fresh ideas which aspects of the international space law could be used or could be developed in the connection with the PAROS. So, and moreover, definitely the legal discussions will be the part of any discussions on any instruments, legally binding instruments, or the instruments of politically binding character or voluntary character in outer space. Definitely they should be and will be the part of the negotiations or consultations or discussions in the framework of developing such instruments. But the first stage of the work on any instrument in outer space, it should be definitely the decision what aspects, what threats should be addressed first of all. We should understand the priority, and for this we need the political will in the first row, actually, to understand where we should go, what goals we should reach, what threats we should remove and address. So only after that it will be the work for military, legal, technical experts, and so on and so forth. So that's my answer. That's my answer.
Thank you. Now, Dr. Pascoe.
Yes, I just wanted to answer quickly your question about the necessary inclusive character of such exercises. I fully share your view that these events should imply the largest number of countries as possible, and especially from Africa. And by the way, it's reiterating what Ambassador Lagos told us this morning. You know, is ambition to secure the participation of all in this current discussions. I think when you see this exercise I was mentioning, you know, this discussions about in the framework of the Hague Code of Conduct, for example, it has a clear educational virtue, I would say. A number of countries who don't even have those equipments or space equipments or space launchers pay attention to these issues, and they can analyze and document it by themselves what's going on, and they can participate fully to the debates. I think this is clearly a necessary step to make these issues that we're discussing together today more real for people, and that will be part of the concrete steps we can make very quickly.
Dr. West?
Yes, inclusivity is important. I think it's important to remember, too, that we need to maintain access for civil society. I think civil society is a key way to bring in different perspectives, different geographical representations, and different political perspectives. And there's a trend in recent years that is a little concerning that involves closing off access to some meetings, to certain discussions, and to participation from civil society. I think we need to push back against that. I appreciate the work of Ambassador Patriota on trying to make those spaces open. But I do want to end on a more optimistic note. I've been following First Committee, which is the committee where space security issues are discussed within the UN General Assembly, for a number of years. And those discussions used to be dominated by a handful of states. Every state has the opportunity to make a statement on all of the topics of discussion, but space used to be pretty niche if you will. And that has changed drastically in recent years. The speakers list on space is significant. The geographic participation is significant. Many more states from Africa, the Middle East, Latin America, states that used to be quiet on these issues are engaged and participating and know that it matters. And I think that's a positive sign, and it helps bring new ideas to the floor. It helps see what different interests are. Again, some of these interests might not be the traditional PAROS issues, but can lead us towards arms control solutions by linking them to sustainability and to economic development, to human security. And so I think that's valuable and important to point out that the participation in this is growing and is becoming much more diverse. And it's clear that most states see themselves as having a stake in outer space. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. And indeed, we need to wrap up. There are still many questions, both in the room as well as from the online audience, but we have to wrap up. I thank you all very much for really our esteemed panelists for your presentations. Thank you, and thank you for the lively engagement from the room and online. Thank you.